You wake up to the smell of burnt potatoes and wet wood smoke. It's cold, damp, and the world outside roars in a language you're still trying to learn. The language of fear, scarcity, and adaptation. It's the autumn of 1939, but the calendar feels more like a suggestion than a certainty. You're in the rear lines of a war that has barely begun officially, but is already devouring resources with the appetite of a spoiled giant. Cooking here is not art, it's survival. You stir a cauldron that boils without enthusiasm, its ingredients less a choice, and more a reflection of what's left in the depot. 2 sad carrots, a handful of suspicious oats, and what you hope is meat. All of it seasoned with a spoonful of bitter irony, and another of practical hopelessness. The smoke seeps into your eyes, your coat collar, your thoughts. You remember your teacher in school saying that humanity civilized itself around fire. Today, it seems more like civilization evaporated in the steam of this watery soup. And still, you stir, because someone needs to eat. Someone, somewhere, will take this bowl and be grateful, or complain. Probably both. The army needs tanks, ammunition, and strategy. But it also needs soup, bread, coffee. Even if the coffee is made from roasted barley, with a taste of regret. Your mission, though rarely shown in hero movies, is to keep others alive long enough for the war to go on. An irony of epic proportions. Feeding the machine so it can keep devouring. The rear barracks are a world of their own. A limbo between the comfort of civilian life and the chaos of the trenches. Here, kitchens are set up in train cars, makeshift shacks, or tents that sway with the wind and the mood of the weather. There are pots the size of bathtubs, stoves that creak like sick grandmothers, and knives that have seen better days. You quickly learn to cut an onion with a pocket knife, and to season with salt borrowed from a French neighbor who swears it's sugar. Around you, others like you, cooks, helpers, nurses, women with hardened gazes and calloused hands. All handling scarcity like taming a wild animal. A potato becomes a feast. Stale bread, a luxury. There is no waste, not even in dreams. Curiously, not all ingredients are in the pot. Many simmer in the rumors alongside the cauldrons that the Americans sent chocolate, that the commander banned garlic because the smell interferes with camouflage, that a cook in Belgium turned soap into pudding. Nothing confirmed, of course. But uncertainty here is a common spice. As historians would say, always with that air of explaining the inexplicable. There is no consensus among experts on the origin of this practice. As the day wears on, the sounds of war approach like lazy thunder. The smell of food blends with grease, distant gunpowder, and fear. There's something comforting in the routine of chopping vegetables, even if vegetables are rare and the knife is dull. Each repetition is a thread of sanity in a fraying fabric. At night, you sit on the wooden step behind the kitchen. You look up at the smoke-stained sky and shy stars. A spoon still in your hand, maybe out of habit. You think of home, where cooking was a Sunday thing, where food came from the market and not from rations. Now, each meal is a silent manifesto. We're still here. The soup's steam rises, dances in the cold air, and disappears into the dark. And you, in the middle of it all, wonder if someone, someday, will want to hear this story. Maybe, if a soft and sleepy voice tells it gently, without hurry, someone will listen. And maybe even subscribe to hear more. Not that it will change the course of the war, but it might make one night feel less lonely. Then, you stand up, crack your knees, adjust your apron, and go back inside. The next batch of soldiers will arrive hungry, and you still have a sack of turnips to chop. The war can wait. Dinner cannot. You open the pantry and find nothing you immediately recognize. A sack of flour that looks more like lunar dust, unlabeled cans stacked like culinary enigmas, and some leftover beans that would have embarrassed even the most forgiving of vegetables. Welcome to the world of wartime menus, where creativity isn't a virtue, it's a biological necessity. In the rear lines, The concept of a meal undergoes a dramatic mutation. What used to be pleasure becomes mission. What used to be seasoning becomes contraband. Eating is now a series of decisions between the unpleasant and the edible. And make no mistake, the edible doesn't always win. You've learned how to prepare rations, created by the Americans with a near-comical nutritional enthusiasm. Each box came with a pack of biscuits, as hard as reality, a can of pressed meat that defied biology, and occasionally a piece of chewing gum, perhaps to remind you there was something sweet in the world. The coffee was instant, but the regret was enduring. On the European side, things weren't much better. The British clung to Woolton pie, a vegetarian pastry consisting basically of whatever vegetables were available, wrapped in rationed flour crust, and an optimism that didn't even convince the kitchen cat. And France. France. Resisted with illegally foraged herbs, homemade apple vinegar, and the wounded pride of having to use margarine instead of butter. There were attempts to maintain some dignity of taste. Recipe notebooks circulated among cooks, often scribbled in pencil on torn newspaper pages, with tricks like replace milk with water and a merciful lie, or bake potatoes with the skin on to pretend it's a new dish. It was the golden age of culinary simulation. Among the soldiers, informal rankings of least detestable foods emerged. The meat stew, when it actually included meat, was almost celebrated. The porridge, a thick gray gruel, was more feared than some tank models. And still, they ate. Eating was surviving. Complaining, a luxury. And then there were the tricks. Cutting ingredients into tiny pieces to create the illusion of abundance. Adding a pinch of pepper when available to stimulate salivation. Mixing everything into one cauldron, so no one knew exactly what they were eating. A tactic effective both for hiding scarcity and avoiding collective panic. The war kitchen was also a stage for cultural contradictions. While the Soviets insisted on endless soups, the Americans tried to push powdered milk on everyone. The Italians did what they could to keep pasta alive, even without wheat. And the Japanese tried to keep rice at the center of everything, even when rice turned to powder or disappeared altogether. Amid these scenarios, almost unbelievable stories emerged. In some British air bases, rabbits were secretly raised by cooks turned nocturnal breeders. In POW camps, bread became currency, and a thicker soup could mean the difference between hope and collapse. You, of course, record it all in a notebook hidden in your apron. A sort of gastronomic diary of decline, where you note the soldiers' reactions to each dish. Today, they complained less about the soup. You write, maybe they're catching a cold, or resigned, or dead inside. Some modern historians try to recreate these recipes on historical cooking shows. They reconstruct rations, remake Woolton pie, analyze calories, but they never manage to capture the real central ingredient. The constant tension, the chronic fatigue, and the homesickness that seasoned every bite. Curiously, among the many mysteries of the war, one persists among experts. No one knows for sure who invented the practice of rationing onions in exact halves per battalion. It may have been a logistical error or a psychological experiment. Both seem plausible. At the end of the day, you clean the cauldrons, scrub the leftovers with a brush that's seen previous wars, and close the wooden door that creaks like a sigh. The sky, once again, is gray, but there's a jar of beet jelly hidden under the floorboards, and just for that, you fall asleep with a faint smile. War waits for no one, and even less for lunch. That's why cooking in the rear requires mobility, improvisation, and an almost acrobatic skill to avoid spilling soup on uneven terrain. You discover this the third time you climb into a train car, converted into a kitchen. Trying to balance a pot full of lukewarm water, while the engineer decides, for mysterious reasons, to test the brakes. Welcome to the ballet of mobile kitchens. Here, cauldrons are strapped down, stoves have wheels, and you quickly learn that any flat surface is contested territory. In the rear, food must follow the soldiers, like a loyal dog, or a persistent shadow, depending on the day. The British were masters at creating horse-drawn mobile kitchens, with compartments for flour, fat, and cynicism. The Americans, always more ambitious, preferred adapted trucks, with portable stoves and gas ovens that made you sweat before even lighting them. The Soviets, a train car, a stove, and a samovar. And of course, a cook with a face that had clearly survived winters worse than war. You remember the first time you saw a kitchen on rails. It was a metal structure, covered in soot, with a smell that alternated between cabbage soup and childhood nostalgia. The stovetop rattled at every turn, and the dishes, when there were dishes, slid around like poorly trained skaters. But food was cooked there and eaten there. The routine was almost poetic, if you ignored the shouts of hungry soldiers and the occasional presence of philosophical rats. Disembark, set up camp, light the fire with damp wood, adjust the cauldrons, prepare the portions, clean with cloths that used to be shirts, then pack it all up and move on. Always hoping the next stop has clean water, salt, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of oil. Of course, accidents happened. Pots tipped over, stoves exploded from miscalculated ignitions, and once, a German cook was allegedly taken by a wild boar while foraging for herbs in a forest. Or so the stories go, although, as always, scholars disagree on the veracity of the episode. There are also the small gestures that become rituals. The piece of bread set aside for the messenger, the secretly caramelized onion, the coffee filtered through a linen handkerchief inherited from a mother. Every cook carries a secret, a superstition, and inevitably, a third-degree burn. And then there's the tea. Ah, the tea. On certain fronts, it wasn't just a beverage, it was disinfectant, anesthetic, mouthwash, and according to a recurring rumor, boot cleaner. Tea boiled to the color of despair was served as a universal balm, a hot sip in the middle of nowhere. A moment of silence while everything fell apart. Mobile kitchens also revealed the character of the troops. Units that cleaned their pans were respected. Units that let leftovers rot inspired suspicion. In times when everything was scarce, how someone treated a dirty spoon said more than a tactical report. Over time, you learned to cook with half-closed eyes, balancing on unstable platforms, stirring broths that may have been soup last week and now are watery memories of vegetables. But you cook because someone needs to eat, and because, in the end, cooking is the only order that always makes sense. That night, after serving the last soldier, a recruit who asked for anything that tastes like home, you sit on the edge of the truck, legs dangling. The stove still gives off heat. You hold a mug of bitter tea and think that, no matter how far the war advances, it still needs you, a war cook, a juggler of turnips, a tamer of rolling cauldrons. The smoke rises and vanishes into the cold air. Tomorrow, you move on. And with luck, maybe the train's brakes won't fail this time. You hear the clinking of spoons, the metallic scrape of pans, and for a brief moment, you think you've gone back in time. Maybe you're in a home kitchen, surrounded by soft voices and the smell of baking bread. But then someone yells, "Fire on production line 3." And you remember you're in a munitions factory, where bread has given way to ammonium nitrate, and the women at the stove have traded recipes for stopwatches. War took the men to the front, but left the industrial kitchens, collective dining halls, and smoky factories in the hands of women. Women who were once invisible behind household windows, now command cauldrons and hangars, serve meals to shift workers around the clock, and feed machines that don't eat, but consume hours. You walk among them, trying to understand how to make soup for 300 people in 20 minutes, with ingredients that are measured by volume, rather than name. They chop, stir, clean, and supervise with a gaze that blends exhaustion and efficient indifference. The kind of look that says, "This place might collapse, but not on my watch." These women, the ones propaganda posters show smiling, always with lipstick and immaculate aprons, are actually covered in soot, sweating, hair tied with improvised scarves, and hands calloused from opening cans and carrying sacks. They have names, but in official bureaucracy, they're just supplementary food service personnel, a fancy euphemism for the ones keeping it all together. One of them, Mrs. Baxter, prepares a porridge lunchbox with a touch of clove. Not for the flavor, but because clove, according to her, wards off sadness and dampness. Another, Madeline, invents games with the evacuated children, helping in the kitchen, guess the vegetable. An impossible challenge, given the state of the ingredients. The female presence in the rear isn't just quantitative, but transformative. They're the ones who organize armament worker canteens, bomb shelter, emergency soups, and cooperatives distributing food to entire neighborhoods in London, Paris, Berlin. Women trading recipes for rations, affection for logistics, secretly keeping notebooks where they record every small victory. Today, I got salt, a miracle. They're not romantic heroines, they're managers, leaders, and above all, survivors. Some even modified pots to work as water purifiers. Others invented ways to bake bread using only steam and stubbornness. And one, they say, used lipstick to draw a meal rotation chart on a wall for lack of paper. A stroke of genius or despair. Experts disagree, and still, humor persists. There are jokes circulating among the cooks. Did you know today's soup got a medal? It's solidified under superior orders. Or, the only thing harder than the potato is the manager's face when we ask for more potatoes. You realize that even far from the trenches, war has its domestic battles. Every portion served, every line organized, every child fed is a small victory against chaos. Food, here, is a nervous system. And these women are the neurons, connecting, adapting, reacting. As night falls, you watch the cooks leave in silence, scarves on their heads, footsteps steady. Some head home, others to underground shelters. One whistles, another carries a still warm kettle. The steam mixes with the cold air, drawing shapes that quickly disappear. You feel there is something profoundly subversive about feeding, about continuing to nourish even when everything tries to stop it. The kitchen, in this moment, is resistance. And the women behind the stove, the invisible generals of survival. You hold the slice of bread like someone examining an archaeological relic. It's cold, dense, slightly damp. On it, a yellowish, unmoving block that, according to the label, and only according to the label, is margarine. You run the knife over it. Nothing happens. More force, the bread gives. The margarine doesn't. During World War II, margarine wasn't just a substitute. It was the main character in a culinary theater where everyone pretended nothing had changed. Governments promoted it with patriotic campaigns, optimistic slogans, and an unsettling insistence that it was the butter of the future. Which, to many, sounded like a threat. You, of course, don't believe it. Not after trying to fry eggs with margarine, and ending up with something that looked like a melted expressionist sculpture. But there it was, in rear kitchens, factory cafeterias, and cans handed out like tasteless gold. People learned, the hard way, to deal with it, to melt it, mix it with mashed potatoes, hide it under layers of sugar and resignation. In Germany, where animal fat was as scarce as critical thinking in radio broadcasts, margarine became a strategic item. Scientists were called in to study how to make it more palatable, which involved adding coloring, flavoring, and occasionally, powdered hope. In England, it was strictly rationed. 2 ounces per week, per person. Just enough to grease the ego, and not much else. Cookbooks changed. Suddenly, everything could be made with margarine. Cakes, soups, fried foods, fritters, even homemade facial creams. One British pamphlet taught how to use it to make fake apple paste, where apple, ironically, was optional. The truth is, no one really knew where margarine came from. Rumors included Wales, cotton, and some state-run alchemy, but everyone knew it was inevitable. You remember one particularly telling episode. A cook in France, Madame Lucette, was briefly arrested for whispering that she preferred real butter. The report came from a jealous neighbor, or maybe a food inspector with a sensitive palate. No one knows for sure. What's known is that margarine, in this context, became a symbol not just of scarcity, but of control. Eating butter was subversive, loving margarine, patriotic, and of course, there were the counterfeiters. People who whipped margarine with herbs, animal fat, even ground chalk to improve the texture. There was an underground market for real butter, smuggled in toothpaste jars, or layered between clothes. A clandestine network of rebellious palates. Like everything in war, what you ate said more than you'd imagine. In the United States, there the story turned even more theatrical. Margarine, called oleomargarine, was despised by dairy farmers, who lobbied for it to be sold uncolored, white as lard, forcing consumers to mix in a packet of yellow dye by hand. An activity that, in some households, became a weekend ritual, and in others, a source of lasting trauma. There is no scholarly consensus on the nutritional value of margarine from that era. An elegant phrase to hide the fact that no one really knows what was in it, besides uncertainty, and the feeling that we were all participating in a grand performance. At the end of the day, you clean the margarine tubs, like someone exorcising ghosts. You scrub your hands vigorously, as if you could wash away the taste. But the taste lingers. Not in your mouth, in your memory. Margarine wasn't just vegetable fat. It was memory, propaganda, scarcity molded into a block. It was what remained when everything else was taken. In the dim light of the kitchen, you open a drawer and find a hardened piece of real butter, saved by a cook who's no longer there. You cut it in silence, spread it on the bread with almost trembling fingers. The smell is different. The taste, too. For one brief, precious moment, the world feels normal. And you remember, this is what we missed. You crouch before a pile of cans, all opaque, all promising, all carrying a faint scent of rust and disillusionment. The labels vanished in the humidity of transport, and now, before you, lie only metallic cylinders containing. Something could be beans, could be meat, could be preserved regret. There's only one way to find out. Open them. During World War II, canned food gained hero status. Not the muscular, fearless type, but the kind that quietly works backstage, preventing logistical collapses and hunger-induced fainting. The canned good was reliable, durable, and, in theory, nutritious. Three qualities that, in this context, made it more desirable than a full night's sleep. You open one of the cans with an opener that groans in protest. Inside, a pinkish-gray paste that presents itself as processed meat, but tastes like boiled cardboard with a hint of soap. It's the infamous Spam, the canned ham Americans pushed onto allies and enemies alike with the enthusiasm of an overbearing uncle. It fed armies, sustained civilian populations, and infiltrated kitchens worldwide, often against their will. British soldiers called it the thing. Soviets considered it an American blessing. French civilians learned to sod it with onions to make it tolerable. And in the Pacific, Hawaiians embraced it with nearly mystical fervor. At some point, Spam became currency, diplomatic gift, and recurring punchline. Of course, it wasn't just Spam. The cans held wilted peas, syrupy fruits seemingly drained of all joy, and soups that tasted like failed industrial experiments. But they were there, defying time, bombs, and bacteria. A triumph of food engineering, and a defeat for gastronomic pleasure. You learned to work with them. To heat them directly over flame, to puncture them with technique, to avoid sudden explosions, to pour off the viscous liquid with swift, controlled movements. You also learn to recognize the sounds. The bean can makes a lazy plop. The meat, a somber schlup. The fruit, a treacherous piche, almost sensual. Almost there were stories, of course. A commander allegedly poisoned by a can of German peas. A group of soldiers who discovered a can of peaches in syrup and shared it like a sacrament. And the famous case of a Canadian cook who mistakenly served dog rations at a military banquet to raving reviews about the authentic seasoning. Cans had other uses too. Improvised pots, ashtrays, containers for letters. In a London shelter, a woman turned can lids into a checkers game for children. A delicate way of saying, yes, we live among shrapnel and scarcity, but we still know how to play. Then there's the smell. Ah, the smell. You recognize it from a distance. A mix of damp iron, expired fat, and broken promises. Some say it's still detectable in certain military museums, in cans sealed for 80 years. Others claim it's just suggestion. Historians, ever diplomatic, record that there is no consensus on the olfactory persistence of wartime canned goods. Today, you have 3 open cans on the counter. One with something resembling feijoada, another with vegetables that defy botany, and a third you've decided not to identify for emotional reasons. You plate them like an abstract artist, creating combinations that are both nutritional and non-offensive. A delicate balance. And then, the miracle. A soldier says thank you. Says it was great. You look at him, expecting sarcasm. But no, he's serious and hungry. And in that moment, you understand, the charm of canned food isn't in the taste. It's in the certainty. It's in survival. In the dim kitchen light, steam rises from the pot, mingling with the scent of iron and nostalgia. You smile tomorrow. New cans, new enigmas, and maybe, just maybe, a peach in syrup. You're in an improvised kitchen underground, literally. 3 steps below the surface, with cracked concrete walls and a ceiling held up by beams that inspire little confidence. The stove smoke accumulates like an ill-kept secret. We're on the other side of the line. Welcome to the rear of Nazi Germany, where cooking happens, yes, but without joy, and with even less onion. While the Allies faced shortages and improvisation, Axis countries dealt with food under a veil of total control, paranoia, and gastronomic propaganda bordering on the absurd. Germany, for example, loved to claim its population was scientifically ideally nourished, a euphemism for eating sawdust, bread, and soup of nothing. You find recipes with heroic names like Victory Stew or National Morale Cake, consisting respectively of cabbage, diluted with hope, and flour mixed with ... more flour. Margarine, of course, reigns. But there are also potatoes, many, and turnips, always them, and occasionally, horse meat. It's said the best recipes came from Berlin basements, where housewives cooked under bombings and shouted to keep the food from losing timing or purpose. In Japan, the situation was no less austere. Rice, the dietary center, was rationed until it became a symbol of sacrifice. Entire families learned to stretch grains with barley, sweet potato, or chunks of pumpkin boiled to the texture of wet toilet paper. Children carried lunchboxes with 3 grains of rice, carefully placed in a sea of ... empty space. Japanese women, dressed in aprons and a forced calm, invented ways to disguise the absence, sculpting food with flour molds, decorating scraps with dried seaweed. There was beauty in presentation, and desperation in content. Some accounts say soldiers received rice balls shaped like animals to keep spirits high, and that, often, they ate them with their eyes closed, not out of pity, but out of disgust. In Italy, bread and pasta also went to war. Flour vanished, creativity exploded, dishes emerged like polenta of hope and symbolic tomato sauce, made with water, garlic, and the memory of tomato. Families exchanged recipes like relics. And olive oil, when available, was used in near liturgical ceremonies. A drizzle on the plate, a silent blessing. You notice a pattern. The greater the control, the more absurd the gastronomy. Dictatorships demanded not only obedience, but also a smile in front of a rotten potato. In German newspapers, Recipe columns taught how to boil banana peels to create a functional substitute for meat. Something only functional if the function was mildly tricking the stomach and deeply saddening the soul. And there are always the extremes. An Italian POW camp, where soldiers cooked with wild roots and illegal herbs. A Japanese submarine, where the crew survived a week on diluted soy sauce and liquid hope. A German air raid shelter, where children were given anise, candies made from flour, salt, and perfume. Of course, as always, academic doubt lingers. There is no consensus among historians about the veracity of the sawdust brigadeiro served in Dresden. But even doubt, in this context, feeds the folklore. Today, you warm soup in a pot that used to be a wash basin. On the other side of the imaginary trench, someone does the same. You think about that. That in every war, someone is always cooking with what's left. That the enemy is also hungry. Also hides onions like treasure. Also boils water with fear and routine. You ladle the soup and serve what you could manage. There is no victory here. Only the sound of spoons hitting plates. And the silence after the last bite. You slam the bread on the table. It responds with a dry sound, worthy of a hammer on anvil. A piece breaks off and rolls across the floor like a pebble from the Rhine's bank. Congratulations, you've just prepared, or received, war bread. An institution as sacred as it is inedible. During World War II, bread stopped being food and became a symbol. And then, a symbol turned dental obstacle. Made with flour of dubious origin, weak leavening, and whipped hope. Rear-line bread came in shapes, ranging from parallelogram to existential cube. Softness, a distant memory. Crunch. Only if we count the shards. You remember when bread was simple. Fresh French rolls, with soft crumb and golden crust. That was before flour was rationed, fermentation rushed, and fat replaced by a mixture no one dared describe. What remains now is a beige, hard block, wrapped in cloths that serve more to disguise than protect. In Germany, Kriegsbrot war bread was so dense that jokes arose about soldiers using it as improvised shields, made with rye, sawdust, grated potato, and faith. It was sliced with hatchets and distributed in ruler-measured portions. The British had the national loaf, a wholemeal bread that, according to the Ministry of Food, was much healthier. A polite way to say, this is what we've got, so pretend it's good. In the Soviet rear, bread was distributed in sacrificial rubles. Each worker received a small amount based on roll and luck. Often, the dough was cut raw and baked in improvised stoves, forming something soldiers called nutritious hot stone. Of course, creativity always found a way. Cooks cut bread into cubes and fried them in old lard to create survival croutons. Housewives dipped slices in black tea and sugar to make a melancholic dessert. Some even invented bread cake, layers of the same bread stacked with margarine in between, forming a kind of resignation lasagna. An obscure curiosity, some intentionally let the bread age to use it as a grater for other foods. A technique not found in modern cookbooks, perhaps due to the high risk of chipping teeth. You know a cook who carves small flowers into the bread's crust with a dull knife. It doesn't improve the flavor, of course, but gives a nearly festive look to what is, in practice, a self-defense tool. She says bread smiles better when it blooms. You don't disagree, but you'd rather not bite. Extreme scarcity birthed mythologies. Children were taught not to waste a single crumb, and every fleck became a symbol of character. Throwing away a piece of bread could be seen as betrayal. In some shelters, rituals were held to divide bread with surgical precision, involving strings, weights, and solemn stares. No consensus has been reached among scholars on the exact proportion of sawdust used in the bread during the siege of Leningrad, though archaeological evidence suggests there was indeed wood on the menu, not as substitute, but as ingredient. Today, you hold a slice between your fingers. It does not bend. It does not yield to pressure. But you spread a thin layer of marmalade on it. gifted by a soldier in exchange for an especially well-seasoned soup. You bite, and for a second there's taste. Not good, not bad, just taste. A rarity in the kitchen, loaves, cool, stacked like bricks. Tomorrow, more flour will be mixed with potato. More dough will be shaped with gloved hands. More smiles will be forced before the crackling crust. And you will go on, slice by slice, building a wall of resistance against hunger, with crumb, cement, and mortar of memory. You pick up a biscuit with 2 fingers and it doesn't budge. It's as embedded in the bottom of the tin as a fossilized artifact. You pull hard. It releases with a snap that echoes through the kitchen. Congratulations, you've just met the aviation biscuit. A small disc of flour, salt, and indifference that is, technically edible. During the war, flying was an act of courage, and eating on board, a transcendental experience, in the worst possible sense. Pilots, between maneuvers and bombings, received portable rations that included hard biscuits, caffeine tablets, and small chocolate bars wrapped with the same enthusiasm as an eviction notice. Aviation biscuits had a clear purpose: to endure, to resist pressure, moisture, time, forgetfulness, and, most importantly, appetite. They weren't made to please, but to occupy space in the stomach and keep the brain functional for one more mission. They were food only by definition. In the US, there was the legendary DeRation bar, a chocolate bar dense as lead, designed to be highly nutritious, unpalatable, and difficult to consume quickly. It fulfilled all 3 requirements with military precision. Soldiers joked it was easier to break teeth than pieces of the bar. Rumors claimed it could be used as a projectile in emergencies. In Britain, the hardtack biscuits made a return from World War I, now even more rigid. One pilot said he'd rather jump without a parachute than chew through 2 of them at once. Another tried rehydrating a biscuit in tea, and created a paste resembling fresh plaster, later used to repair cracked mugs. The Japanese joined the game too, with rations of pressed rice, soy sweets, and compressed biscuits wrapped in rice paper. The Italians improvised with dry bread soaked in cheap wine, which at least softened the fall. If not of the plane, then of morale. You hear curious stories while handing out the functional food packs. A mechanic swears he saw a biscuit deflect a bullet. A nurse tells how she used one as an emergency splint. A German cook, smirking, says one survived a bombing unscathed, and now serves as the mess hall's mascot. It's there, framed, with a plaque, indigestible, unbreakable, immortal. Of course, there were attempts to improve the biscuits, adding spices when available, dunking them in hot soup when there was soup, or the trick of holding them under the armpit for a few minutes to soften them when desperation was high. None were particularly effective, but all were part of the involuntary comedy of wartime kitchens. A bizarre curiosity. Some pilots would draw faces on the biscuits before eating, a symbolic ritual to ease the guilt of biting into something so stoic. Others simply collected them. One American had a box full, each marked with the date and place received. An archaeology of the absurd, as he called it. And as always, the fog of historical uncertainty remains. Experts disagree on the exact composition of Soviet combat biscuits, as many didn't survive the war, or were mistaken for construction material. Today, you hold one of those biscuits, looking at it with respect and slight terror. You tap it on the counter. It doesn't give. You dip it in hot water. It plays dead. Then, as a kind of ritual, you take a bite. And for a brief moment, you feel something. Not flavor, its texture, its resistance. You chew slowly, as if reflecting on humanity. And you think, maybe, deep down, these biscuits weren't food. Maybe they were just solid reminders that if the body can withstand this, it can withstand anything. You're chopping carrots. They're a bit limp, but still firm enough not to qualify as vegetable sadness. Beside you, a colorful poster clings to the kitchen wall. Feed the army, strengthen the homeland. The image shows a smiling housewife, raising a ladle of soup, as if offering liquid salvation. You, knife in hand and shoulder, aching. Consider it a peculiar form of fiction. During the war, cooking stopped being a domestic act and became a patriotic duty. Calories were conscripted, pots enlisted. The patriotic stew became a symbol of civil obedience and military strategy. Food propaganda became more than nutritional guidance. It was an ideological tool, with the right slogan for every bland meal. In England, the Ministry of Food created campaigns with titles that sounded like cheerful songs but hid pure scarcity. Dig for Victory encouraged planting vegetables in backyards, sidewalks, empty lots, and possibly potato sacks in apartment corners. Radio programs featured celebrity-narrated recipes, and mass-distributed leaflets offered tips like how to cook without crying, even without onions. Recipes were meticulously adapted to sound comforting. Lydia's soup, Invincible stew, Pudding of hope, clever names for tired vegetables, and recycled fat. You remember a recipe distributed in a French camp that suggested mixing flour with wine and faith, a sequence of culinary and spiritual instructions. The United States, masters of spectacle, released posters of smiling food. Literally, a steak, smiling with pea eyes, a chicken waving a flag. Food fights too, they proclaimed. Food now fought by your side. Eating well was as important as shooting straight. And eating less was, paradoxically, an act of national generosity. In Germany, food propaganda was even more intense. Food purity was linked to ideological purity. Cooking with German soil ingredients was a nationalist exaltation. Forced substitutions, like barley coffee or beet butter, were promoted as signs of moral superiority. A pamphlet instructed, "If you eat with pride, even turnip tastes like glory." Of course you know at least 3 soldiers who vomited that glory into muddy trenches. Curiously, a later study would show that food propaganda significantly increased consumption of certain forgotten vegetables, like kohlrabi, turnip, and the much-maligned beet. Partly due to marketing, partly due to the absolute lack of alternatives. In the rear, you become a repeater of these mantras. You learn to say this strengthens the body with a straight face, even when serving soup made with potato peels and bones boiled to abstraction. You memorize slogans and pretend to believe them, like everyone else. A collective choreography of forced optimism. A little-mentioned curiosity. In the USSR, there were entire poems dedicated to the potato. Published in newspapers. Recited in schools. The potato as proletarian heroine. A tuberous ovation. Of course, among cooks, alternative slogans arose. Chew for your country, but swallow for yourself. Or, a turnip a day keeps flavor away. These jokes never made the press, but circulated in kitchens like moral leaven. You look again at the poster on the wall. The woman still smiles. You imagine what she'd say if she had to skin a frozen fish with a butter knife. Probably nothing. She'd just keep smiling and serve. At the end of the day, you serve the stew. It bubbles in the bowl, with a consistency somewhere between broth and memory. A soldier looks, hesitates, then says, "At least it's hot." You reply, in patriotic. He laughs. You do too. And for a moment, the soup almost tastes good. You're hiding behind a stack of soap boxes. The smell is strong, but it does a good job masking the scent of the soup you've hidden in a cauldron covered with thick cloth. The kitchen here isn't a room with windows and shelves. It's a dark gap between 2 bombed-out buildings. With wind creeping through cracks, you've plugged with wet rags. You're cooking for the resistance. And in the resistance, every spoonful is a calculated risk. In times of open war, there are quieter wars too, and they're hungry as well. The partisans, the refugees, the saboteurs, the peasants who chose not to obey, all depend on hidden kitchens, disguised menus, and fires that produce no smoke. You learn there's an art to cooking without leaving traces. Pots with tight lids. Ingredients that don't give off aroma. Underground fires with air vents camouflaged by leaves. And the hardest part, cooking for many with enough for few. Soup is the ideal dish. You can dilute it, thicken it, disguise it. Today's has a hint of turnip, a pinch of grated carrot, and something that might be meat broth. But you don't ask where it came from. Better that way. The rule of clandestine cooking is simple. There are no secrets, only ingredients without identity. In occupied France, cooking for the resistance was considered an act of subversion. Women hid loaves of bread in sewing baskets, olive oil jars and paint cans, sugar in flour bags labeled light cement. A group in Marseille became known for preparing lunchboxes that looked like trash, and thus passed through checkpoints without suspicion. In Poland, there was the practice of invisible stew, a boiling technique using minimal water cooked in clay stoves that produced no smoke. Recipes were passed mouth-to-mouth, like passwords: 3 handfuls of cabbage, 1 of silence, 2 of care. And in Yugoslavia, partisans hid food in caves and hollow trees. One cave was known for its constant smell of garlic. It was called the Devil's Bakery. Bread was baked there once a week, using smothered embers and flour carried in at night, along paths that existed only in the memories of elders. You speak with a Russian cook, Olga. She shows how to hide an entire pot beneath the floorboards, with ropes to quickly pull it into shelter at the first alert. She also keeps a spoon with a secret compartment where she hides powdered garlic. She smiles and says, "War takes everything, except taste." There were also coded meals. A piece of bread on a windowsill meant meeting scheduled. An onion hung on the door, danger nearby. A jar of honey left on the stairs indicated safety assured. Once again, food as secret language, flavor, and message in the same bite. Of course the risks were immense. A whiff in the wrong air, a boiling noise at the wrong time, a soldier with a sharp nose. Many of these kitchens were destroyed. Many of the cooks taken. And as always, uncertainty lingers. There is no conclusive documentation on how many clandestine kitchen networks operated between 1943 and 1945. The records were burned, and those who knew stayed silent. Today, you serve the soup with a wooden ladle, silently. Each bowl placed carefully on the ground. Each portion exact, no leftovers. The faces before you don't smile, but there is relief. Hunger quiets. For a few minutes, the group falls silent. Only the sound of quick spooning can be heard. You observe, breathe slowly, and realize this is the most dangerous kitchen in the world, but also the most sincere. Here, every meal is a declaration. Every dish, a manifesto. Amid the smell of smoke and recycled grease, something survives, folded inside an apron pocket, or hidden beneath a loose floorboard. A notebook, small with stained pages, a makeshift cover of wrapping paper, or faded fabric. That's where the true memories of war rest. Not in reports, not in speeches, but in recipes. Not lavish recipes, of course. No lobster in white sauce, or apricot mousse. These are humble notes. Soup with potato peels grate well. Boil twice. Add bay leaf, if available. Small instructions scribbled in hurried handwriting, interspersed with affectionate reminders, like "Don't forget. Clara likes it without onion," or "Better not repeat the barley porridge, it caused arguments." These notebooks appear everywhere. A seamstress in Warsaw, writing recipes on the back of military orders. A Canadian soldier, pasting packaging labels and noting underneath. Adding mustard improves the taste, but only if no one sees. A Dutch grandmother, spending nights copying made-up recipes, imaginary stews. She calls them to keep her mind busy, while bombs explode outside. There's beauty in these crooked pages. Not because they hold extraordinary flavors, but because they document the attempt to preserve normalcy where none exists. Among date entries and failed culinary trials, there are short poems, sarcastic comments, doodles of happy carrots, lists of impossible groceries. In Paris, one such notebook includes a recipe for eggless omelette. made with flour, water leavening, and good humor. Next to it, someone wrote, "Works if no one knows what it was supposed to be." On another page, a birthday cake recipe using breadcrumbs, marmalade, and a candle made of shoe wax. Records say the birthday girl cried. No one knows if from emotion or intoxication. In concentration camps, reports indicate that prisoners recited recipes to one another as a form of comfort. They were banquets recited by heart. First you sought the garlic and olive oil, ... Then add the tomato, very ripe, ... These descriptions fed the spirit more than the body. A German prisoner said years later, imagined food was the only thing they couldn't take from us. The tradition of notebooks survived even among those without paper. Some cooks memorized entire recipes, reciting them like prayers. Others wrote with charcoal on scraps of wood, which later became firewood. A fleeting act, but loaded with intent. If I cooked, I resisted. If I wrote it down, I existed. Curiously, many of these notebooks were kept, passed down through generations. Today, they sit in archives, libraries, museums, or still in living kitchens, stained with recent grease. But with the soul of 1943, one has a final note. If this war ends, I will make this bread with real butter, I swear. And, as expected, the haze of the possible lingers. There is no consensus among historians on the origin of the first collective recipe notebook among prisoners. Some say it was in Czechoslovakia, others in a camp in the French countryside. Perhaps, like the bread of the time, it arose in many places at once. As you flip through these pages, even in silence, something happens. The recipes speak, not in kitchen commands, but in murmurs of remembrance. Here, there was care. Here, with nothing, we made something. Here, there was still flavor. Not all hungers have a name. Some hide in the corners of history, between the paragraphs no one wants to reread. They are hungers that never became monuments, that don't appear in school textbooks, but that gnawed bones with the same ferocity. And in times of war, silence also has a flavor, and it isn't a good one. In occupied Greece between 1941 and 1944, food vanished with an almost literary swiftness. German convoys took grains, olive oil, meat, and even the chickens, scratching around courtyards. In Athens, people sold heirlooms for a piece of bread. Records speak of soup made with flowers, cakes from orange peels, and children licking salt stones as if they were rare candies. Hunger settled like a thick fog, and when it finally withdrew, over 300,000 Greeks had died without fanfare. In the siege of Leningrad, winter became a living creature, and hunger its cruelest accomplice. For 872 days, the city's inhabitants counted crumbs as if counting hours of life. There was a ration of 125 grams of bread per day, and that's when bread existed. People ate carpet glue, paper paste, boiled peels. A baker wrote in his diary, "Today I made bread with charcoal, dust, and straw." No one complained. There are many accounts, but many were hidden out of shame or censorship. In rural China, under Japanese occupation, entire villages vanished from lack of rice. In parts of Poland and Ukraine, peasants traded harvests for promises, and, when all else was gone, for memories. In Tokyo, women cooked clay dumplings to soothe their children. Make no mistake, actual clay. Molded, baked, and served with excuses. These hungers don't appear in official statistics with the clarity they deserve. Partly because regimes weren't interested in documenting fragility. Partly because, for survivors, reliving the taste of hunger is harder than forgetting it altogether. The mouths went silent, but the stomachs didn't, said an Italian cook who lost her sister in the winter of 1944. There is a kind of food that only exists in extreme contexts. Mixtures of nothing and almost boiled long enough to seem like more. Wind soup in Alsace. Absence cakes in Sicily. Memory mash in Hungary. Foods with poetic names and invisible ingredients. Creativity wasn't a luxury, it was the reflection of despair. In the war's rear, you hear stories of mothers pretending to eat so their children would believe they were all full. Of families dividing one egg a week as if it were a pact. Of people fasting not out of faith, but out of lack of choice. And amid it all, there were still those who laughed. Laughed with irony, with fatigue, with clenched stomachs, because even laughter feeds, a little. And as always, history hesitates. There is no academic consensus on the total number of deaths from hunger in occupied areas during World War II. Estimates range from 2 million to 10 million, depending on the source, political interest, and surviving memory. Today, as you stir a pot of dark broth with ingredients you'd rather not name, those voices seem to be there, in the bubbles. You serve a ladleful with a steady hand, but your thoughts drift. To the kitchens that left no scent. To the plates that left no crumbs. To the meals that were only intention. And at the bottom of the bowl, when everything is eaten, the same echo always remains. There was hunger, there was life. There was someone who, even with nothing, still tried to cook. War ends the way certain fevers do. Suddenly, without clear warning, with the head still hot and the senses dulled. The gunfire ceases, the bombs go silent, but the stomach still growls with the same cautious tone. Peace arrives, they say. But it doesn't come on a supply truck, it comes as a whisper. And, with luck, in a sack of flour. The first meals of peace are awkward. Attempts to return to normal without knowing any more what normal means. You prepare a stew with real meat, an event bordering on magical. But the smell is too strong, almost indecent. Some soldiers vomit. The body no longer recognizes what was once every day. In Germany, kitchens collapse among the rubble. Women dig pots out of basements, wipe off the dust with improvised cloths, and try to bake bread in cracked ovens. The Americans arrive with shiny packages, and Spam reappears, now labeled as humanitarian relief. A fine irony. The same canned meat that sustained the war now feeds the peace, but at least it comes with chocolate. In London, children discover colorful candies for the first time. Some are afraid, others lick them with near religious reverence. In the markets, the lines continue. Food returns, yes, but slowly. Habits don't change with a treaty. Some still dilute milk. Some still hide bread under the bed. Old reflexes die hard. The recipe notebooks, now more scribbled in than whole, receive new entries. Banana cake with actual banana. Whole chicken, yes, whole. Relearning how to fry. Ingredients return, but appetites remain shy. Many people must first convince themselves that abundance isn't a mirage. In France, cooks take out their embroidered aprons. Cafes reopen. Bread finally smells like bread again. But even among golden baguettes, there's a shadow. That kind of silence, only those who've known scarcity can understand. A baker says, "We've started eating again. Now we need to start trusting again." And of course, not everyone returns. Many cooks, helpers, pot washers, disappeared without name or farewell. Their recipes lost. Their flavors evaporated. But now and then, someone stirs a broth and recognizes an old seasoning. An echo of someone who endured. In Italy, mothers begin teaching recipes like prayers. This is for when everything's missing, and this is for when it returns. Olive oil fills bottles again, but it's used sparingly. A drop still carries weight. In some homes, butter is received with tears. In others, it's eyed with suspicion, tastes like illusion. On the other side of the world, in Japan, Reconstruction arrives with rice, but also with American rations. Children grow up unsure whether they prefer miso or powdered milk. Palates merge with the post-war world, and a new cuisine begins to emerge. Unexpected fusions of tradition and convenience. As expected, history hesitates again. Experts have not reached a consensus on the true extent of post-war food transformation. Cultural, economic, and emotional changes quietly shaped the world's new taste. Now, you cook with everything at hand, but you miss the challenge. Not the hunger, never, but the ingenuity. The small act of creating something from nothing. The ritual of grating a potato as if sculpting patience. The art of making soup with 3 ingredients and faith. And as you serve this dish for the first time without rationing, you notice something strange. The food has flavor, a full flavor, complex, but most of all a taste that doesn't just come from the mouth, it comes from memory. From that part of the brain that remembers what was missing, what remained, and what was done to keep going. Now that it's all over, or at least seems to be, the kitchen rests. The big pot is still on the stove, but it no longer bubbles. The spoon lies on the counter, like an ancient sword in its final repose. The floor is clean, with small crumbs of bread that discreetly escaped the last meal. Outside, the world begins again. Inside, everything is quiet. You notice the remnants of war in the details. A grater with worn-down teeth, the dish towel sewn in risoon, the wooden spoon with a darkened handle from holding thin broth and lukewarm promises. These objects are now relics, not of great battles, but of small victories. The ones won with watery soups and unleavened cakes. The smell still floating in the air is of fried onion and accumulated history. Nothing special. But you recognize it like the scent of an old friend who survived everything. And, indeed, it has survived. Outside, children run with whole loaves of bread in their hands. Some let crumbs fall to the ground without noticing. You see them and feel something between relief and anger. Not at the waste, but at their not knowing what it means to conserve. At the same time, you hope they never know. That their children grow up without learning what it's like to eat flour mixed with clay. That they never look at a potato and see in it the only certainty of the day. You sit with a piece of warm bread, real soft, alive, and hold it between your fingers like you're holding condensed time. There's no rush, no train whistle, no curfew bell, no air raid alarm. Just the bread. Just you, just the kitchen. The sun filters in through a crack in the window, painting the table with golden, unhurried light. The crumbs glimmer for a moment, as if dancing. There are sounds of cutlery in the distance, calm conversations. A very low radio playing something that sounds like jazz or lament. Everything blends, everything softens. You close your eyes and breathe deeply. You remember the hardened margarine, the label-less cans, the bread that could break ribs, the aviation biscuit that survived war and digestion. You remember the smell of soap-masking soup, the solemn faces in endless lines, the recipes scribbled with fear and non-existent butter. You remember it all, but without pain. As if each memory had been washed, dried, and folded with care, like the old dish towels now resting in the drawer. Around you, the kitchen is no longer a battlefield. It is a sanctuary, a stage of survival turned into a home. The stove smiles quietly. The sink gleams subtly. The apron on the hook sways with the breeze coming in, gentle, smelling of mint. And as you chew, slowly, with respect, you feel that everything, the hunger, the invention, the fear, the lost and rediscovered flavor, is there, in the bread's soft center. It's not an ending, just a clean plate, ready for the next day. The spoon rests, the pot cools, and the world, at last, falls silent.